The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
The way we want to be taking charge of our attention is together. That is what liturgy is for. That is what morning and evening prayer is for. That is what collective acts of hospitality and giving and service are for. And there's something exponentially more powerful about turning our attention with other people towards the same thing on repeat.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Elizabeth Oldfield hosts The Sacred, a podcast about our deepest values, the stories that shape us, and how we can build empathy and understanding between people who are very different. She has a regular column for Unheard magazine and has appeared on BBC One, Radio 5 Live, Radio 4, and The World Service. Her work has appeared in the Financial Times, Prospect, The Times, CNN, The Guardian, and beyond. She's also a contributing editor at Comment magazine, a guest lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and former director and now senior fellow at Theos, the UK's leading religion and society think tank. Her new book is Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. It was my great pleasure and privilege to talk to Elizabeth Oldfield for this episode of the Habit Podcast. Elizabeth Oldfield, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. Thank you for making time to be here.
It's a joy.
Let's just leap right into this thing. Your new book, Fully Alive, you start with the story of your own sort of there and back again journey, the will she, won't she thing of you and the Christian faith. You say, I'm supposed to be one of the growing majority of people who have long relegated Christianity to the scrap heap, and yet here you are, back in the faith. So I'd love to hear you. There's a phrase you picked up from Paul Ricoeur that I'd never seen before: the second naivete. You've come to the second naivete. Can you give us a quick version of your story?
Yeah. So I wasn't what I sometimes call a fetal Christian. I wasn't raised by parents who were very focused on passing on the faith. I think my dad probably quietly was a Christian, but it was very, below the surface. And my mum definitely wasn't. And so there was a bit of background noise, but my real introduction to the faith was being taken to a charismatic evangelical youth festival by a friend who fancied a boy, and so invited me to her youth club. We were 14, early teens. And it was very much just something to do, low adult supervision. But towards the end of that week of that festival, I stopped just hanging around the skate park and went into one of the big meetings and despite the fact I was quite freaked out by everyone around me praying in tongues and falling over and crying, all these things are very alien to me.
Yeah.
I thought, they seem happy. There's something seems to be good here. So I prayed, God, if you are there, would you show me? Mm-hmm. And I had a very powerful experience of an answer in a way that I still don't really know how to write about or think about, sort of outside the region that words can get close to. But that was the change. That was the start. Had maybe a bit less than a decade in those kind of churches, was very happy, had a lovely time. Did my quiet times, read my nice bits of the Bible, sang them with my hands in the air. And then meanwhile was kind of developing a kind of intellectual life, a professional life, and ended up on working at the BBC. And I bounced around the BBC, and then I landed on a production team trying to make a drama series about the Bible.
Yeah.
And in order to be a researcher for that, I had to know everything about the scholarship. I had to ring all the world experts, really understand the world in order to work out how to put it on television. And I was assigned Joshua Judges, 1 and 2 Chronicles, and 1 and 2 Kings.
That's rough.
And I didn't know those books. I knew be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
That's what I knew. I knew the 2 or 3 nice inspirational Instagram post verses.
Yeah.
I had no hermeneutic. I had no theology, really. I had no way of knowing how to read this book. And so it all fell apart quite rapidly. And I had what is now called a deconstruction. I think then it had not gone through that rebranding, and it was just a dark night of the soul or a crisis of faith. Mm-hmm. But the language makes sense to me. It did feel like something falling apart around me, like my home was, the foundations gave way. Yeah. So those were the 2 real dramatic turning points. And the return was much slower and more cautious. And there were lots of things on the road that helped me. But I think that the main thing was I just didn't know how to shake God off. I was trying really hard to be an atheist. Yeah. I really was trying. But every time I prayed, every time I tried to say in my head, I don't believe in God, it would come out as I don't believe in you. And it was, even now I have to stop and pause and think, how do I say the sentence? Because it doesn't feel true. And it didn't feel true. And eventually I thought, fine, I'm gonna have to come to some entente cordiale and find my way to live with this wild God who won't let me go.
Yeah. And now you live in some sort of commune. What's with people of all kinds of people.
So, the actual housemates are very small. We call it a mini monastery.
Okay.
It is, Christians are quite familiar with the language intentional community. As it turns out, I realize, having written this book, people beyond the church are not familiar with the language intentional community, and commune is the closest thing they know. So that's got some associations that we would not ascribe to ourselves, but fine. So yes, a very small monastic inspired intentional community, 2 families with guest rooms and a kind of practice of hospitality. We've turned the garage into a chapel, and we do morning prayer, and we do compline, and it's quite inspired by the very early L'Abri moment, that sense in a place where people who have big questions, who are searching for meaning and belonging, can come and find a welcome and wrestle things through. Yeah, so there's a library. We're a bunch of nerds. We like it when people come and talk about books.
I misunderstood what kind of place you lived in. I thought it was, 50 people from all over the place. Okay, no. Good.
I mean, there's often 50 people here.
Okay.
So there's an extended community, but the permanent housemates are just 2 families.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about writing a book about faith, about your faith, that doesn't assume that the reader shares your faith.
Yeah.
I love that idea. Tell me about that.
Yeah. It's surprising how radical it is, isn't it? It shouldn't be.
It's odd how radical that is and how unusual.
Realizing that that there wasn't a genre category for this book was, when you're talking to publishers and agents and booksellers, and they're like, but what shelf does it go on?
So what shelf does it go on?
Well, we had to make a really strategic kind of hard-headed comms decision about that. And the place we wanted them to put it really was highbrow self-help / modern wisdom. Okay. So people like Oliver Burkeman, who has been very kind about it, Krista Tippett, Catherine May, all of whom have been very kind about it. People who are, serious thinkers, wrestling with philosophy or what does it mean to live a wise life now? But I wanted it alongside those people, not at the back in the, buy your Godchild a Bible section.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. The question was, when you're writing about your faith for people who don't share your faith, what are some strategies? The floor is open for you to discuss that idea.
Thanks. Well, I think it's just my particular vocation. I have always been a kind of bridge person, translator, partly, I guess, because I've been out and then in and then out and then in again. Yeah. I don't feel... And most of my friends would not call themselves Christians, right? I have very, very close Christian friends, but a lot of the people that I want to live up close with, this is not their frame of reference, it's not their language, and I love them, and I think God loves them too. And a lot of them have accumulated a lot of baggage and a lot of stories about this precious thing to me that are not true or are not the whole story. And the things I really want them to know, they don't know because that story's not being told. So I think starting from the posture of just listening, I have spent a lot of time listening, partly through the podcast that I host and the work that I've done, just trying to understand what people are actually worried about, and what they care about, and the kind of language that makes sense to them, and what they're longing for. And then in order to meet them where they are and to say anything that makes sense and is useful. And then I think this kind of, the thing that puts me off, the real trigger for me was how careful so many Christian books are. And I think that's because they're very regularly written by pastors or theologians, who I love. Some of my best friends are pastors and theologians. But the formation of a pastor or a theologian is rightly avoiding error, or at least partly avoiding error, right? They're really wanting to take care not to lead anyone astray, right? Not to say anything wrong. They carry the weight of souls. But it means that very often when I'm reading a Christian book, I feel sort of curious about if they're as sure as they sound. Yeah. And part of my brain thinks, I don't think you are as sure about that as you are trying to sound. Yeah. And also, it's really hard to get a picture of the actual person who's talking. They might throw in a few sort of little details of their lives, a few self-deprecating stories, but really that's just a delivery mechanism for the idea. Yeah. And as a reader, honestly, that whole genre doesn't really interest me. I don't want ideas delivered in this disembodied, impersonal, pseudo-objective way. That's not my theory of knowledge. That's not my theory of wisdom. And so trying to write the kind of book that I would want to read, which was someone writing with as much honesty as they could about their own struggles and weaknesses and uncertainty and complexity, and to give a sense of myself, hopefully in an appropriate and bounded way. And that came particularly because my agent, who is not religious at all, said to me, you're trying to do something hard. There's not a pre-existing market for this. I will listen to you on these things because I know you and trust you. Yeah. And I care. You have gained my trust enough to be able to talk about these things, even though I don't come the same place as you. You need to do that for the reader. They need to know who you are so they can trust you. And once they trust you, they will be able to listen to you. And if not, no one's going to pick up this book who doesn't already agree with you. Yeah. I really, really appreciate the way you talk about sin and bring sin back. I say bring... I guess sin's always been there, so you didn't bring it back. But the way you talk about sin, I think, is incredibly helpful. And your willingness. I mean, I guess it's chapter 1. It's right after the introduction where you say, "We're just going to get this over with." I'm interested in
I mean, you make a really compelling case that sin is an incredibly helpful category for people who aren't comfortable with that language. You make a great case for it. You say fully aliveness is summed up in connection, and your definition of sin, sort of working definition, is everything that works against connection, which might sound like somehow soft pedaling sin, except that every bit of trouble in the world derives from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I especially appreciate this idea that when the old way of talking about sin was to separate sin from a person's identity.
Yeah.
You say, my choices are not my identity. I don't have to move from I did a bad thing to I'm a bad person. And so, yeah, I would love to hear you say more about that.
Yeah, I just feel, I didn't set out to write a book about sin. It felt like honestly, I felt like led into it and somewhat reluctantly.
Uh-huh.
But when you're trying to offer what is fundamentally just a sort of relational anthropology, which is for me a Trinitarian anthropology, right? A vision of the human person that is fully alive in relationship, in deep connection with our own soul, with, I think, the created world, with other people, and yes, with God. But even if you just, with people who are very nervous of the God concept, starting with trying to help them understand we are not individuals. Actually, we are interconnected, we are interdependent. A relationship is the start of everything. We all can nod along to that, right? It sounds nice. It sounds, sure, aspirational values, principles. I'd like to live a relational life. I'd like to live a connected life, but we don't.
Yeah.
And so the kind of alternative explanations, which are, it's all about your childhood.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it is partly. It's all about your attachment theory. Yes, it is partly. It's all, it's all about your temperament. It is partly, but the way that a complete removal of our own of the sin language has left us with this weird mix of no one is really responsible for anything, but neither can anyone really be forgiven or redeemed. Yeah. It's this weird, like the sort of toxic brew of the alternative moral universe, the sort of sinless moral universe, just seemed to me to be very deadening and leave people with a lot of despair / carrying a very heavy burden of self-improvement.
Uh-huh.
Whereas when you start with sin and forgiveness, and I think hyphening that to hold them together as tightly as we possibly can, because different parts of the church put too much emphasis on one or the other, saying there's something in the way. We do the things we do not want to do. We all want to love our neighbors, to be just, to be loving, to live good lives.
Yeah.
And it's hard, and there is something stopping us, but it doesn't, to help them understand that problem, but also that problem is not the end of the story, that there is hope beyond it, that we are not left on our own with it because of this relational anthropology, felt important to me and just true, right? When you sort of get through it, when someone gets it and they manage not to have the associations of the hellfire and damnation preachers or the sort of naughty anti-Puritan, rebellious, calories and lingerie associations with sin, and they see the brutality, they see that the Francis Bufford thing of the human propensity to F things up.
Yeah,
it's quite relief to look it in the eye and go, yeah, there's a problem.
Yeah, and there's a problem, but it's the kind of problem to which there's a solution, whereas. And the solution, by the way, is not self-improvement, but you make such a good case that leaving, to take away the concept of sin is to leave us. We still have the complete mess that's caused by, this double-mindedness. Sure, I want to be in a relationship. I also want to be the boss of everybody around me. I also want full autonomy while I also want to be in relationship with others. And that psychology, that anthropology makes a lot of sense. And when I try to deny it, as you said, we find ourselves, in maybe, I mean, I hate to use the buzzword cancel culture, but
Yeah.
cancel culture is,
Graceless.
I believe in, I might not use the word sin, but I believe in sin. I just don't believe in redemption and forgiveness. And so I really appreciate your willingness to say reclaiming the idea of sin is really a good way to achieve emotional, relational, civic health. So
and it's a frame for us to reflect on ourselves, right? I think the reason people are very nervous about sin is it's a kosh to be other people with and to finger point, and that's when you see the secularized version of sin, which externalizes evil to some other group, to everyone outside of ourselves. And that I don't want to bring sin back as a way of pointing the finger at other people. I don't actually think that's what my tradition teaches. I'm not supposed to be concerned about the speck in other people's eyes. I'm supposed to be concerned about the log in my own, and that naming the tendency to deep disconnection in myself feels like a really good place to start in trying to live the sort of life I long for, and I think my soul is made for, and which I so often fail at.
Yeah. Well, you say something that I found very provocative, and I'd love to hear you comment on it. You said maybe we're tempted to reject the Christian moral universe. We think it's because we don't like sin, but it might be because we don't like forgiveness.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think that's part of what's at play here. And some of that will be temperament. I actually think we have these moral taste buds that in the high world that show up in our politics, and some people really long for justice and order. And so, a lot of this is temperament, but we are so quick to see other people's failings and failures, and we want there to be justice for them. And the idea that they might be, we don't really want justice for ourselves, if we're honest. The idea that they might also be forgivable and redeemable, everyone, right? This is the most radical belief that I hold. This is the most offensive belief that I hold, that no one is beyond the reach of redemption, that no one is irredeemable, and lots of actions are heinous, but no one is irredeemable. And that goes so, because once you lose a Christian moral universe in which the problem of the human, the problem of humanity runs through the human heart, but you still live in this universe in which clearly we are not embodying justice. In order to deal with that cognitive dissonance, you have to externalize evil to other people. And if evil is in other people, then you can't deal with it by them being forgiven. That's not how you deal with the problem. Whereas when you bring it back into this sense of collective complicity in disconnection, our own fragility and failure and foolishness and our inability to live up to this thing I think we are deeply and naturally oriented towards, which is the love of God and the love of neighbor, then one, we can stop finger pointing at other people, and two, we can actually get serious about our own growth and our own growing up in our souls and becoming the kind of people that the world needs.
Yeah. So to clarify, are you saying even people who voted for a different candidate than you can be redeemed?
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
All right. So the main body of your book is just a tour of the 7 deadly sins. And I have to ask, did somebody talk you out of a title or subtitle that referred to the 7 deadly sins?
No, and I can say this because this is a podcast about writers and writing and the craft. It came quite late. So I knew that I had some things to say. I started with, I want to write about the way the structures of attention that my religious practice gives me feel like they stabilize me in a very, in a attention economy. And I wanted to write a feminist defense of the Christian sexual ethic. And I wanted to write about status anxiety. I had maybe 4 or 5 of the themes half written. And I want to write about Christianity and theological wisdom for a mainstream audience. And I went back to my agent and she said, you need some sort of structuring device. And so the 7 deadly sins thing came a bit later and then forced me into properly writing about sin in a way that I probably wouldn't have got to otherwise. But I didn't start thinking I want to write a book about the 7 deadly sins. I thought I want to write a book about the wisdom of this theological tradition for the mainstream audience, and this is a useful structuring device.
Okay.
And they sort of understand it as a concept, and it's sort of religious enough for them to get hold of it, but is also sufficiently a meme that it's not, it's not like I'm structuring around the Nicene Creed or something, which would be a more difficult thing to get hold of.
Yeah. Okay. So you frame.
I want to know whether you think someone should have talked me into it or out of it in the subtitle.
I can't decide. As a person who's very comfortable with that kind of theological language, I would have been more inclined. Like, the title "Fully Alive" doesn't make me want to pick up the book.
Yeah.
When I realized the way to be fully alive is to deal with the 7 deadly sins, then I wanted to read it. But a good way to starve to death is marketing around the kind of things that I'm interested in and like. So your 7 main chapters are the 7 deadly sins, and so wrath from polarization to peacemaking, avarice from stuffication to gratitude. And so I really appreciate this movement toward something better. Maybe I want us to camp out for a minute on acedia, moving from distraction to attention. I think it's so relevant for people to do creative work. But before we do, I guess the way these chapters seem to be structured is, here's how this deadly sin disconnects us, and here's how the opposite of it connects us. I don't know if you have more to say about that, or if we just want to move on.
No, I think insofar as I thought it was important to start with the problem, I don't want to leave people with the problem.
Yeah.
I wanted to have a sense of, actually, it's very easy, I think, to end up in despair if we're paying too much attention to the ills of the world and the ills of our own heart. And it's a narrow way, right? This growing up our souls. It's not easy, but it is also beautiful and humanizing. And so giving people something they want, that sort of explaining what I wanted to move forward, giving them something that felt inviting or at least interesting to be moving towards, felt really important. To just, I want to serve the reader, right? I want them to go away feeling moved, challenged, equipped, comforted, not just, I fully understood the depths of human depravity, because that wouldn't be a book I'd pick up.
Yeah. Okay. So acedia or sloth is the more, I know acedia and sloth aren't exactly the same thing, but I want to talk about this movement from distraction to, I think talking about that chapter will give listeners a good idea of how this book works. And I think, again, that idea of moving from distraction to attention is so valuable for people who are trying to write or do other creative work. So let's work through this idea of acedia, moving from distraction to attention. You've already brought up the term attention with regard to your spiritual practice. So can you walk me through let's just talk about kind of what your argument is in that chapter, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think when people think of what might be the riches that religions can offer, Christianity has to offer for the questions that people are asking outside the church, attention is not necessarily the first thing springs to mind, right? Rowan Williams says people know that what they get from religion is ethical reflection and maybe some existential comfort. But he says their hidden genius is they know how to structure time. And when you know how to structure time, you know how to structure attention. And when you know how to structure attention, you take control of your formation. You take control of who you are becoming. It's why they are sort of uniquely good at helping people change over time. Because of these rituals and rhythms. And I think the fact that a large number of those rituals and rhythms are collective is absolutely key. What you see amongst people who are kind of spiritual but not religious, or neither, is that we have so accepted the logic of individualism that all of our solutions are, I need a different morning routine, or I need to come off social media, or I need, all of these optimization, productivity hacks that we try and apply to our lives. And what my tradition says is, sure, you should probably focus on some prayer and meditation for yourself. You should probably read the scriptures a bit yourself. But largely, over the centuries, the way we want to be taking charge of our attention is together. That is what liturgy is for. That is what morning and evening prayer is for. That is what collective acts of hospitality and giving and service are for. And there's something exponentially more powerful about turning our attention with other people towards the same thing on repeat. And so I kind of go through all the things that for Christians will be very familiar, like what is liturgy and why would you do it? And why does showing up at the same time every week and being reminded to be generous and being reminded to confess your sins and admit your brokenness and being told a story of which you are a small part and sitting alongside people who are not like you and using your body and singing and kneeling and all these things that we just like, was just church, just show up and go to church. Just like radically wise, astute. My friend Casper, who writes about this from a more secular perspective, calls them spiritual technologies. It's like, it is sort of how humans work. This is how humans work. Yeah. And it is our inheritance that these things over time change us. They form us. We turn our attention and we shape our desires in the direction of the kind of people we want to be becoming. And it's not foolproof, and we are well able to be as hypocritical and failed as anyone else. But when you think about attention, a rule of life, liturgy, communal structures are exactly where we should start. And it's been very radically transformative for me.
Can you talk about how it has transformed your work as a writer, this movement toward more and better attention?
Honestly, I wouldn't have called myself a writer until I moved into community. I wanted to be. I used to write poems. I've written a few plays. I've done some journalism. But the actual serious work of getting down and writing a book didn't start in earnest until I moved into community, until I was up close with other people who I was not married to on a regular basis. Because not only were we praying together, not only were we sharing together regularly, but my vocation was more regularly visible to other people. And I had other people holding me accountable. And I would come down to dinner and someone other than my spouse would say, have you written anything today? The witnessing of each other's lives up close and that practice of shared attention gives you, I think, an awareness. We talk about community makes you brave. And so I'm not sure, I still am on my phone too much. I'm still distractible. I still procrastinate, all of these things about those, the things that are hard about doing creative work. But more people know about that struggle than they would otherwise. And there are more people who I trust and have permission to call me out when I'm not doing something because I'm scared or I'm, writing something easy when I should be writing the hard thing that I know that is mine to write. So I'd say it's more about actually the container of community of which our collective practice of attention are a big part than necessarily those practices themselves.
That's so good. I always say, you have to go into the cave to write, but it really helps know there are people just outside the cave, who need what you're doing or who are interested or who are cheering for you or whatever.
Yeah. One of the other things I do is I'm a coach and I coach people on a range of things, but one of the things I'm doing increasingly is sort of creativity coaching. And I realize that what I'm often trying to do is help people find their equivalents to what I have in community. What are you going to do? Who are you going to tell that you're going to do it? Who is going to celebrate with you once you've done it? How are you going to break this down into small steps? How are you going to, just how do you have the visibility and accountability of other people to help you take this thing seriously that we are always tempted to deprioritize because everything else seems more urgent and important.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about a dilemma that you touch on, which is, an honest approach to the subject of God is necessarily, well, I say necessarily, that may be overstating the case. Your approach is, it's apophatic. It's beyond language. And yet, you're trying to use language to talk about it.
Yeah. Yes, it is that was a hard chapter. I call it the G bomb.
Yeah.
And I'm very clear that it's last because I want people to trust me enough to go there with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is so obviously one of those things that would be better in poetry than in prose.
Yeah.
But if you're going to use language, it should probably be poetry. And so it's perhaps my most poetic chapter. It's the one where I gave myself the freest rein to not be trying to make a point or an argument, actually.
Yeah.
To, as honestly as I possibly could, say, this is what it feels like to me to know that I'm loved by love beyond me.
Yeah.
And it did feel like treading on holy ground. I don't think we should take that word lightly. I don't think we should throw it around as if everyone knows what we mean. My husband always says, God is not a proper noun. In our tradition, the love that reveals itself to us has a story, right? It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that came down in Jesus Christ. That the particularity is important, and the particularity of our experience is important. And taking, as people interested in words, taking a lot of care with that word. It's in square brackets throughout most of the book until I get to that chapter, which is very interesting when you're trying to record an audiobook. How do you express square brackets in audiobook? But to express that I'm not throwing that word around lightly, and that it's a sort of placeholder for all the people for whom actually that word will automatically set off a little bit of a threat response.
Yeah.
Like just saying, I know, stay with me. Stay with me.
Yeah. So I've been neck deep in Ian McGilchrist and the Master and His Emissary and Right Brain, Left Brain. And the whole time I was reading your book, I just kept sort of applying his ideas to what you were talking about. And by the way, I think the left brain, right brain is so helpful in understanding what Paul's talking about the things I don't want to do, I do, and the sort of double-mindedness that he talks about. And then there was Ian McGilchrist in your last chapter or two, and so I think this is relevant to what we were just talking about. The work you do, the work we all do, needs to be coming from the right brain, that part of our brain that's open to the wider world, that doesn't create its own, that doesn't reduce things down to schemas and linearity and that sort of thing. And yet, writing a sentence is, by definition, an act of linearity. And it's the dilemma of every writer who's, well, I shouldn't say, I guess there are some writers for whom that's right up their alley. But I don't know what the question is there. But I just, you're
I appreciate you.
Yep.
Yeah, I appreciate you picking up on it because it is very central. And Ian McGilchrist's work has been a big influence on me for about 8 years. I first came across him quite early days when it was just beginning to come out into this liberatory thing of the place I feel most at home, which is in the intuitive and the embodied, in the imaginative. I was running a Westminster think tank at the time and feeling like a massive fish out of water in policy wonk world.
Okay.
And thinking, I don't know if we can talk about these things effectively in this very thin, as it turns out, left hemispheric way. But at the time, that was all very coded as fluffy, soft. There's a whole gender thing in there.
Yeah.
And the legitimizing, ironically, by a very academic man, which was exactly the kind of voices that I was struggling to find my place among, the legitimizing of a voice that I was grasping towards in this book, which takes seriously those right hemispheric ways of knowing and doesn't say they're secondary or they're less likely to help us understand the world as it really is.
Yeah.
Was very liberatory. And it also gave me permission as someone who is a Christian and does care about people coming to know the love of God to put it at the end, that chapter. because I come from, part of my Christian story has been in parts of the church that really do want to start with beliefs. They want to start with doctrine. They want to start with proclamation. They want to start with I find quite binary ways of thinking about lots of these ideas. They want to say there's one definition of what's going on the cross, and I felt very clearly that for me and for most of the people that I care about, that wasn't going to be a way in for them. That wasn't going to be a way that they could come to understand the beauty of this story and this tradition. And but actually these right hemispheric forms of attention, ritualized, communal, embodied, imaginative, intuitive, might help them see the world as it really is, might help them see something that is really there.
Yeah.
And in sort of sociology of religion terms, that you're always thinking about believing, belonging, and behaving, although behaving just means sort of practicing. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to start with believing. I'm going to start with belonging and practicing and these right hemispheric forms of attention, because I think they actually make it easier or harder to believe, to come to trust a person, in my understanding.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Elizabeth, I always end with the question, who are the writers that make you want to write? So I'm really interested to hear your answer to that question. Who makes you want to sit down and do your thing?
Yeah. Patricia Lockwood, who wrote Priest Daddy, which is this very funny memoir of her dad, who was a Catholic priest, converted later after she was born. He was married. And she wrote a book called No One Is Talking About This. I would say very literate in the faith, obviously, with her childhood. I'm not sure whether she'd call herself a believer, but she doesn't write like anyone else. She's absolutely hilarious. And she, in a sentence, she can move you from snorting your tea out of your nose to feeling like stabbed in the heart by the pathos of the human condition. Extraordinary writer. I love Sarah Perry, who's another novelist.
I don't know her work.
Yeah, it's her most recent book's called Enlightenment.
Okay.
Obviously, Francis Bufford Unapologetic was a big reference point for me, feeling like a book like this might be possible. Marilyn Robinson, all the greats, but it's almost always people writing novels or narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction. I rarely read a kind of straight nonfiction or Christian book that I feel inspired by. I might learn something useful, but it doesn't change me in the same way.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth Oldfield, this has been so much fun. Thank you for being here. I love your book. I hope a lot of people read it.
Thank you so much. It's been a real delight to be here.
I hope it gets I hope it's in the right part of the bookstore.
Give it to your friends. That's the hope. Okay. That it will be an easy gift to give to someone who you'd like to start a meaningful conversation with.
Oh, yeah. That is true. All right. Well, thank you. The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.